Good evening and welcome to a Friday night edition of Tysky Sour. Tonight we are talking about Boris Johnson betraying the North by rolling back on some of his HS2 promises, COVID in Europe, not looking as good as it has been over the past few months, and Jordan Peterson's intervention on Question Time last night. That's definitely one to watch. I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing, Aaron?
Michael, I'm very good. Thank you for asking. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm not too bad. I should say, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the breaking news that Carl Rittenhouse has been found not guilty of all charges. On first glance, seems incredibly shocking. I should say we're not going to cover that tonight just because we didn't have time to book an American guest, and I don't think I'm in a position to really do the story justice, but it's, I imagine, something we could well be coming back to on Monday. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel. If you have any comments or questions, tweet them on the hashtag TyskySour. In 2019, Boris Johnson gave a speech at the Manchester Museum of Science and Industry and said the following: "I want to be the Prime Minister who does with Northern Powerhouse Rail what we did for Crossrail in London. And today I'm going to deliver on my commitment to that vision with a pledge to fund the Leeds to Manchester route." 2 years on, so that's in February this year, the Prime Minister told Parliament the following: "I can certainly confirm that we are going to develop the eastern leg as well as the whole of the HS2. This week, the government announced it was scrapping both. As you can see from this Sky graphic, the eastern leg of HS2, which would have linked Birmingham to Leeds, is being scrapped. Instead, the eastern leg of HS2 will only go so far as East Midlands Parkway, which will sit between Nottingham and Derby. At the top of that map, you can also see the proposed Northern Powerhouse high-speed line that would have linked Manchester, Bradford and Leeds has been scrapped." Keir Starmer used the announcement as an opportunity to highlight Boris Johnson's habit of breaking promises.
The north of England have been betrayed because the Prime Minister made two very important promises. HS2 all the way to Leeds, a new line. That promise has been ripped up. He also promised the Northern Powerhouse Rail a new line from Manchester to Leeds, and that plan's been ripped up. This was the first test of levelling up, and the government has completely failed and let down everybody in the north, and you can't believe a word the Prime Minister says.
The government's defence of the revised plan is that they still involve upgrades across England's network, even if there are fewer brand new lines. For example, in terms of journey times, they argue, whilst the Leeds to Manchester route won't be quite as fast as previously planned, it is still going down from 55 to 33 minutes, and that 33 minutes is only 4 minutes lower than in the original plan. However, and on the flip side, other journeys will be significantly longer under the new plan compared to the one that's been scrapped. Leeds to London, which you can see at the top of this chart, will now take 1 hour 53 minutes instead of the 1 hour 21 minutes it would have taken on HS2. Birmingham to Leeds also gets much longer than had been projected. That's taking 90 minutes instead of the 49 minutes it would have taken under the original plans. What that chart shows was that while most cities will still get improved connectivity, it will be limited compared to previous plans. So it's still getting better, but not as good as it had been promised. But there are some cities left with no improvements at all. Most notable here is Bradford, which would have been a station on the original Northern Powerhouse Rail, but now gets nothing at all. Nada. And Yorkshire is the big loser on the revised plans, which did not go unnoticed. You can see here the Yorkshire Post argued the region had been sold out by Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister is, as usual, not accepting fault. Here he is talking to Channel 4 News.
What we're doing is levelling up across the country by giving people in the Midlands and in the North the kind of commuter-type services that people have been accustomed to in the southeast.
You've broken your promises to people here, pledges on Leeds to Manchester. Do you think, you're cutting, you promised Northern Powerhouse Rail between Leeds and Manchester, and you're talking about speed, not capacity. Do you think people in the north are stupid?
You're talking total rubbish, because we're doubling capacity between Manchester and Leeds.
But you're cutting capacity on what it would have been.
We're trebling capacity between Liverpool and Manchester. And of course, Christian, there are going to be people who always want everything at once. And there are lots of people who say, well, look, what we should do is carve huge new railways through virgin territory, smashing through unspoilt countryside and villages, and do it all at once. Now, the problem with that is those extra high-speed lines take decades, and they don't deliver the commuter benefits that I'm talking about. We will eventually do them. I mean, we're building more than 100 miles.
Yeah, but you're derailing levelling up here, aren't you? Yesterday you said you crashed the car on Sleaze. Now you're derailing levelling up by cutting your promises.
Total rubbish. Total rubbish. This is you're talking total rubbish. This is the biggest investment in rail in the history of the country, or at least for 100 years, and it's a fantastic thing.
That was Boris Johnson insisting that the revised plans for rail upgrades will mean the Midlands and North get commuter-type services comparable to the South East. He also insisted that capacity across the network is being increased and that we can now do this without smashing through villages and get the upgrades done to a faster timetable. Is he right? I'm joined by Jon Stone, the Independent's policy correspondent, who has written extensively on HS2, the go-to guy on Twitter for commentary on high-speed rail. Thanks for joining us this evening. What's your on Boris Johnson's revised rail plans?
Yeah, I think Northern leaders are right to be disappointed, actually, and feel betrayed. They actually spent years working with the government as the co-client on this project. So they didn't just pull it out of nowhere. They were working with the Department for Transport at every step of the way, drawing up these plans. The government suggested it was going to go with it, and then it just at the last minute took it to review and then came back and its Treasury says no. What they were asking for wasn't pie in the sky. They were already being pragmatic. And I think the key thing to get across here is that those journey times that the government's put out are actually quite misleading, because this project is partly about journey times. Journey times across the north are too slow, but it's also about capacity. And basically what the government's done is they say they can do this scheme just by upgrading existing lines. But what that doesn't do is add a lot of capacity. So really, to properly improve capacity, what you need to do is to separate those high-speed services going between the centres of Leeds and Manchester, or the centre of Liverpool, from the commuter services that stop at every station. If you have them all on the same line, then it really restricts capacity a lot, because the fast services catch up with the slow services. You have to leave a lot of space in the timetable. You can run fewer trains per hour. You separate them out, and there's actually a much better service for slow trains and fast trains. And really, that's what's missing here. So when the government says it's increasing capacity, it's really misleading, because they're just talking about city centre to city centre capacity. But the people who will really lose out are people at smaller stations and towns, which is what the government sort of says they are, the people that the government says that will actually benefit. But that just isn't the case.
And that's because, as you'd sort of described, and it was a while ago, I call it your seminal HS2 piece. The issue is that trains can't overtake each other on the same line, right? So what the government is saying is that when, for example, I'm plucking the numbers out of my head, but before we had 2 trains from Leeds to Manchester an hour, now it's going to be 4 trains an hour. You're saying that's not what really matters. What really matters is you can have an intercity service that doesn't have to wait for the high-speed train to go, all the way across before it can start again. So you need 2 lines so you can separate those.
Yeah, so you can always try and cram more trains on the same line. But I mean, what the government hasn't talked about when it says it's going to increase the number of intercity trains is that there are stations that it's not just that there are stations that won't get improvements. There may actually be a situation where smaller stations actually get a worse service because they're trying to squeeze those extra trains down the line. And, you just end up with the faster trains missing more stops. And really, overall, it could actually end up with a worse situation. And with railways, you always get the case where there's a trade-off between how much you try and squeeze out of the railway and how reliable it is. So when you're trying to squeeze more down the same line, if something goes wrong, then it goes to pot. And that's another big problem with railways in the north, is the reliability. And the reason that they wanted a separate line, it wasn't just because they wanted all the bells and whistles. Actually, what they were asking for was quite standard. And in any other Western or even Central European country, there would be a high-speed line connecting the two biggest cities in the north, or in the primary region. And this country just seems unable to build it, really.
Why is that? Because obviously there's a short-term thing here. Rishi Sunak has said we don't want to spend more than 3% of GDP on capital spending. People are saying this is just an arbitrary Tory decision. At the same time, I mean, this isn't a new thing. Like, Britain just seems to be absolutely terrible at building, well, I say rail infrastructure, but kind of any infrastructure at all. Like, why are we so bad at this?
I think there's a lot of reasons, and it's a complicated answer, but I do think that probably the most important thing we could do to fix that is just to have proper regional and local government in this country. If you look at somewhere like France or Germany, I mean, these are countries where France is considered to be quite centralized, but you have local mayors and regional governments that basically push these projects forward, and they can raise their own tax. They don't just advocate for them as ours do, but they can actually raise their own taxes. They can actually raise their own money on the bond market sometimes, or borrow, to actually do these projects. And in this country, you need Westminster's attention, and you need their attention for a long enough time to plan and deliver a project. And that isn't always the case. And there's also a slightly separate issue that you mentioned, which is, the Treasury is the Treasury, and it just seems allergic to borrowing to invest. And I mean, it's difficult to know what you do about that. Maybe there's a case for abolishing the Treasury and replacing it with just a normal finance ministry that doesn't have so much sway. I don't know. Maybe that's a topic for another day. But and it's also worth noting that generally, although things are particularly difficult in the UK, I think it is a matter of degree. Other countries do have problems building some things, and it's not just the UK where there are issues. I mean, China's built a lot of high-speed rail in the last decade, more than the rest of the world combined, and that's very admirable. But it's also a lot easier for an authoritarian government to just build stuff. There's no judicial review. Planning isn't really a problem for them, and they can just do it. So there is a trade-off, and we're probably never going to be able to go at the same speed that they are.
And does that explain the cost as well? Because I mean, even I'm sort of generally in favour of spending money on things that aren't fossil fuel powered. So I'm pretty pro HS2, but I was always kind of confused about why the cost went from £20 billion, which was the estimation in 2010, to £107 billion, which was the estimate the projection a couple of years ago. Like, what explains that? Is that just how much this stuff costs, or was there some weird mismanagement going on somewhere?
So the cost question is a really interesting one, and it's actually a lot of reasons taken together. I think for HS2, the main one is that HS2 is actually a lot of different projects merged into one. So it's a major redevelopment of Euston Station, which costs a few billion quid. It's a major tunnel into London underground, which costs, again, billions of pounds. It's basically like building Crossrail again. The Eastern Leg would be a separate project. Redoing Birmingham Moor Street would be a separate project. In a country like maybe France or Germany, they would do these as individual discrete projects. Maybe the state government would take control of some of the more local stuff like station redevelopments. Here we bundled it all into one. Like, HS2 isn't just a mega project, it's like 5 or 6 mega projects. Another reason for the cost is that it's also I sort of hinted it before, it's fundamentally different to a lot of continental high-speed railway lines as well. So in somewhere like France, Belgium, Italy, they actually already have a lot of capacity in their city centres. I used to live in Brussels, and there's a massive 6-track railway viaduct going through the centre that they built in the 50s by knocking down half the city. And the high-speed trains, when they get to the city centre, they run on that. But the UK doesn't really have anything like that in city centres, so we're having to actually build that. That's the most expensive bit, because building in the centre of the city is expensive. You need to use a lot of land. The land is more expensive. It's more disruptive. You kind of have to put it underground. You wouldn't be able to get away with knocking down half of London or Manchester or Birmingham now. So, I mean, really, once you take into account a lot of that stuff, then it probably isn't too different to the cost of projects elsewhere. I would say, are these projects more expensive than they need to be because a lot of people are making a lot of money off government contracts? Probably. I would expect so. I don't have any particular evidence, though, to suggest that that's more the case in the UK than, say, Italy or France, or particularly on HS2 compared to other projects in the UK. Although, there's clearly there is a problem with costs on major civil projects just running out of control.
Got a few super chats I want to go to now. Thomas Crump with a fiver. Can you tell Jon I love his cycling videos? Oh, and Tiski as well, obviously. So you do cycling videos about how to get from one place to another in London without going on the main roads, right?
Thanks. Yeah.
My memory is not good enough to be able to then, follow the route afterwards. So I just have to rely on Google Maps. Nick Claffey on YouTube Super Chat, 25 quid. You are the highlight of my Friday every week. Thank you so much. It's very kind. Phil Richards with a tenner. I'm torn on HS2, but I do think that reducing traffic on the roads is a good thing on the whole. It makes sense to increase rail capacity. I agree. Well, I suppose I'm less torn on it. I think just build the goddamn thing. I want to go to one final point is there a brute electoral logic going on here? This is a reference to something Stephen Bush wrote in the New Statesman. So he said on this decision, on this scaling back decision, although scrapping the Birmingham to Leeds leg of HS2 does harm the North, it also means avoiding large-scale construction projects in Ashfield, Bolsover, North East Derbyshire, Rother Valley and other marginal Conservative constituencies in South Yorkshire and the Midlands, where HS2 means years of building work but no new train station. And the broader argument that he's making in that piece is that while, doing HS2 properly, that would benefit lots of the cities. The cities vote Labour anyway, and it wouldn't necessarily benefit the more, peripheral towns. So that's why they're not bothering to do it. Do you buy into that argument at all, Jon?
I think it's difficult to know what the government's thinking is. I mean, there's some evidence for that because HS2, where it goes through and doesn't stop, is unpleasant. On the other hand, it will actually benefit towns and smaller towns and cities because it's what allows you to take the fast trains off the existing main lines and to run more stopping services to those towns. So it does actually benefit them in that situation. But then on the other hand, that hasn't been very well communicated by the government. I would say probably very, very few people know that because the government hasn't even made that argument, really. It's just in the technical documentation of what railway engineers say it's for. On whether or not the government has used that logic, I think maybe it was something they took into account. But I mean, a lot of the so-called Red Wall MPs, like say Jake Berry, who's chair of the Northern Research Group, which is the sort of self-appointed group of that amongst Tory MPs, he actually was the most outspoken for keeping the Eastern leg in particular. So he actually challenged Boris Johnson at Prime Minister's questions the day before and said, please keep your promise, do what you said you were going to do. So I mean, other MPs are less pro it. I think Ben Bradley was celebrating it as a decision. There's that bloke from Ashfield who keeps getting into a lot of trouble, who I think was probably quite anti it as well. It may have been a factor. I think, to be honest, the main thing was probably the cash and just the Treasury dogma.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I suppose the argument that, even if it would give them more frequent trains, you don't get a shiny new station, I think is partly what Stephen Bush was getting at. Jon Stone, thank you so much for coming on this evening and sharing your expertise on this rail story, because I have to admit, I would have been a little bit lost. So thank you so much for speaking to us this evening.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to get your thoughts on this, Aaron, because I know you covered for Ash today on the Cortado, and you wrote about this topic and this story. And your takeaway was, partly that, it was a disappointment that they'd retracted from their full plan, but you also highlighted that the government, saying they're going to spend this much on infrastructure, that's still kind of new and suggests that the political centre has moved somewhat. Do you want to expand or elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, it would have been good actually to keep Jon here, because maybe he could have pulled me up on some smoke and mirrors, which I've been too credulous and taken the government at its word. But the government essentially said yesterday that it was going to invest £96 billion in public transport infrastructure. Of course, last month with the budget, I think there was £6.9 billion that was being spent on public transport in major cities in the north. So Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds got some news on that yesterday. Some updates on the West Midlands. So you're looking at like £100 billion worth of funding. HS2 still an extraordinarily large project. Of course, HS1 has principally happened during the Conservatives since 2010. They chose not to axe it as a coalition government. One of the things they chose not to axe, and Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is entirely of their confection. And yes, it's radically pared back, but it's still quite a big investment in public infrastructure. And it feels to me, Michael, that this is more than what Ed Miliband and Labour were offering in the 2015 manifesto. Even in 2015, in the manifesto, it's available for everyone to read online, very clearly states we're pro HS2, but for as little as possible. So the idea that they would have, done the Eastern Spur, that they would have done Northern Powerhouse Rail, I find that very unlikely. Keir Starmer in 2017 himself opposed HS2 because it was going to create noise at Euston. I mean, maybe you don't live in central London, but whatever. Maybe I'm being unfair. That's what he has to say as a local MP. I get it. So it does feel that the sort of political centre on this kind of stuff has shifted quite dramatically, partly because of, yes, Brexit, but I think also partly now, and Jon sort of touched upon this, you've now got the emergence of two distinct forces in English politics you didn't have before. Firstly, these new mayors, who are increasingly prominent, particularly Labour mayors at the moment, Manchester, Liverpool with Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Tracy Brabham's only just got in, a few other figures. I mean, they're the most prominent ones, obviously, because where HS2 goes. Less so Andy Street in the West Midlands. He's perfectly happy with what's going on because he's a Conservative. But they're a big, prominent voice. And then you've got these new Tory MPs in quote-unquote red wall seats, one of who is Jake Berry, who is dissenting on the government's position on this, saying we need to take this further. And they're actually the outriders on this, and they're pushing the kind of political common sense quite a bit further here. So Westminster, the likes of Keir Starmer, Ed Miliband, Rishi Sunak, this is not the sort of infrastructure they would have been comfortable doing just a couple of years ago. And now it feels like there's this arms race going on about who can build the most high-speed rail in England. Labour was in government for 13 years, and I'm not knocking Labour here. I mean, it's a terrible record. It's just an observation. Labour in government for 13 years, they barely built any really innovative public sector infrastructure when it came to mass transit, really. I mean, the real leader on this stuff was, of course, Ken Livingstone, and he did that initially standing as an independent in London. So, and that's not to sort of fixate on the past and blame Labour. It's to say clearly something shifted now in terms of levelling up, in terms of taking infrastructure and spending and politics outside of the M25. That's really new. And what I say in the Cortado today or last night, people would have had the pleasure, I hope, of reading it this morning, is that perhaps, and I say this provocatively, that doesn't happen without Brexit. You've now got millions of voters in the Northwest, and the West Midlands, and the East Midlands, and the Northeast, whose votes are no longer taken for granted, and who now want a piece of the pie. And that might sound like I'm sort of rotating political cliches in circulation every 10 minutes on the BBC, but before 2015, they really were secondary in the conversation. It was about keeping on top of the budget, austerity, we can't spend too much, low tax economy. And the Tories and the Labour Party kind of had a great deal of consensus on that. That's now shifted. One of the big themes in English politics, I don't say British politics, English politics, is more spending on critical infrastructure outside of London. Of course, London's had that for quite a while, had Crossrail. It's had a bunch of other spending as well over the years. Far more per head is spent on transport in London than anywhere else in England. That's increasingly being recognised. And it wasn't that long ago that people like Laura Kuenssberg were mocking Jeremy Corbyn for raising the price of bus fares outside of London, how it was simply unaffordable for regular people. That's now the political common sense. Not because of Corbyn, but I think it's a factor. Corbyn, Brexit, and of course, more recently, COVID-19.
Tom P tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, yes, infrastructure costs a lot up front, but that's why it should be upgraded continuously rather than just leaving it for decades until it's so decayed as a whole that it needs totally overhauling. I think that's a good point in most scenarios. I mean, I suppose with HS1 and HS2, what Jon is saying is, it's not so much that the existing lines have gone into disrepair, it's just that sometimes you need two lines. You need a fast line and a slower line. So I'm not sure if the reason we need HS2 is because they weren't maintaining the existing lines, but I'm sure that applies in many areas. And let's go to our next story. Austria currently has Europe's highest per capita rate of daily COVID infections, and as a result, the country's chancellor has announced that from Monday, Austria will enter a 3-week lockdown. Now, lockdown has, of course, become a much abused term. We've become used to even minor restrictions in the UK being called lockdowns or a threat of a lockdown. But in this case, it does genuinely fit the bill, according to the Associated Press. People will be able to leave their homes only for certain specific reasons, including buying groceries, going to the doctor, or exercising. Wolfgang Muckstein, the country's health minister, said that kindergartens and schools would remain open for those who needed to go there, but all parents were asked to keep their children at home if possible. This is a proper lockdown. At the same time this lockdown was announced, the government confirmed another policy to limit infections: mandatory vaccinations. Austria's Chancellor Alexander Schallenberg has announced that from February, all Austrians will be obliged to get vaccinated. The details of how the mandate will work are yet to be confirmed, but Schallenberg has said failure to get vaccinated will likely result in a fine. So why is Austria taking such drastic action? The country, alongside other German-speaking nations, has lower rates of vaccination than the rest of Western Europe. So you can see almost 25% of Austrians over 12 have not had a single dose of vaccine. That compares to 13.6% in the UK, 8.9% in France, and a stunning 1.5% in Portugal. So 98.5% of people over 12 have had at least one dose of a vaccine in Portugal. Quite incredible. That higher rate, as one could probably guess, appears to have contributed to a higher caseload. So on Friday, people in Austria tested positive at a rate of 1,400 per 100,000 people. It was an all-time high for the country, and for a comparison, that compares to a rate of 580 per 100,000 on the same day in Britain. So you can see there, Austria far and away, really high case rates. You've got down at the bottom there, France, Italy, and Spain. They've all got very high vaccination rates and are doing pretty well. Germany, again, not particularly good vaccination rates, and it's now catching up with the United Kingdom. We have been sort of at a steady state, but at a high level for quite a while now. Combined with low vaccination rates, these high infections are feeding into high levels of occupancy in intensive care units. So as you can see there, Austria, again, way up there compared to its European neighbours, and ultimately to higher death rates. So you can see again there, Austria higher and dramatically increasing. That's the kind of spike you don't want to see. Again, what you see there is the United Kingdom at a fairly steady but high state. It's now been overtaken by Germany, Belgium, and Austria when it comes to death rates. So why is it the case German-speaking countries appear to be suffering from low vaccination rates? I mean, I imagine it's not something intrinsic to the language, but according to the Financial Times, polling by Erfurt University gives some indication why many Germans don't want jabs. 80% of unvaccinated respondents said they needed to weigh up the risks and benefits first, and 41% simply considered vaccination unnecessary. Anti-vaccine sentiment intersects strongly with anti-establishment and populist politics. A Forsa poll conducted on behalf of the German Health Ministry found that half of unvaccinated respondents had voted for the right-wing populist AfD in the recent federal election. In Austria, the right-wing populist Freedom Party has become vociferous in its opposition to vaccination measures. Last month, party boss Herbert Kickl spoke about terrifying links between vaccines and tumours. We can also see how the Chancellor of Austria explained the need for mandatory vaccines. So he said, after making the announcement, "The political consensus has been against compulsory vaccination in this country, and I also believed people should be persuaded to be vaccinated for their protection, for the protection of their loved ones, but also for the protection of society. But we have too many political forces, flimsy vaccine skeptics and spreaders of fake news in this country. Despite campaigns, too many people have still not been vaccinated." Austria joins Indonesia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and the Federated States of Micronesia as the only countries to have made vaccines compulsory. Aaron, I want your thoughts on this. We've tended to be fairly relaxed about things like vaccine passports. Is compulsory vaccinations for everyone taking this a step too far?
I mean, it depends on the context, doesn't it, Mike? We've had this debate so many times. If you're in a situation where you have a pathogen like Ebola, which kills 50% of the people it gets, I mean, you're gonna introduce something like that. And I think hard and fast rules, one way or the other, I would never do this or I would always do this, probably don't make much sense. In terms of why this is happening in Germany and Austria, it's quite interesting. I think it can be traced back to the fact that, they do, and again, this is not a general rule. I'm not universalizing this idea. But with systems that have proportional representation, you have these smaller right-wing parties who, while they don't necessarily win power, do have a huge amount of say in the sort of public conversation. And we don't have that in the UK. And so if you look at a party like the AfD, small, probably won't ever get near power. But what you do see in German civil society is a major political player, which is climate denying, which is, overtly Islamophobic, and then does stuff like this. You look at the Tories, as terrible as they aren't climate deniers. There are huge amounts of climate deniers in them, but they want to be in a party which is near power and can be, can make money, and they want the status. So they have to go into this broad tent organization because of the nature of our electoral system, and they have to be relatively, on some things, quite moderate. They can't be explicitly climate denying. They can't be saying that vaccines don't work, although many of their members think that. I'm sure many of their MPs think that too, privately. Some. So it's a different game with the Freedom Party and the AfD in Germany. And look, I've always, same on climate change, I've always backed proportional representation because I think in a democracy you need a democratic electoral system. But this is one of the downsides. You will have political organizations which appeal to a significant minority of public opinion and sway it. That's part of democracy. Good. But this can happen. So, it'd be interesting to see a sort of comparative study about this stuff and electoral systems. On the other hand, of course, the United States is first past the post. It's a simple two-party system. This is also a problem there, although not seemingly as bad as in the German-speaking countries. So it's an interesting hypothesis. Meanwhile, in Britain, you have some pretty crazy opinions over here. But because you've got the public service broadcaster, which I'm not a fan of, that model, having a huge quasi-monopolistic share of broadcast media, because you've got the two-party system, actually these circles which refute vaccines, which say we shouldn't take it, etc., are far smaller than in Germany and Austria. That's not a comment on whether or not they're right. I don't think they are right. I think these people are generally speaking nuts. I'm sure some of our viewers disagree, but it's an observation as to why I think it's happened in Germany, less so here.
I think Germany is still better than the United States. The United States is, Germany only looks bad now compared to where it was a few months ago and compared to highly vaccinated Europe. America is still screwed on this front. Yeah, I mean, I would, I do find your PR argument very persuasive, but yeah, as you say, I was going to point out that America are a very different story. I suppose you could say that again with the climate, it's the same, that in PR, you are going to get those extremes, which when it comes to vaccines can be, dangerous. When it comes to climate, less so, because it doesn't really matter if you've got a minority of climate skeptics, so long as there is a consensus which is pro taking action on it, or at least pro accepting the science as a sort of base level for policy making. But yeah, and with the first past the post system, it's a big risk, right? Either you completely exclude vaccine skeptics and climate deniers from politics, or you give them one of the two major parties of government. And I do think that if the Republicans win the presidency in 2 years' time, it's going to be really terrible for the climate. I know, we often talk about how the Democrats and the Republicans on so many issues, they're very similar. Having just one of the most powerful governments in the world, not believing that COVID is particularly real, not believing that climate change really matters, I do find that quite terrifying. Let's talk about what's going to happen in Britain. One thing that I think is going to become apparent in terms of sort of political discussions about COVID policy is that cases are rising in European countries where policies like mandatory face masks are in place. So I think that perhaps some of the pressure for our government to move to Plan B will dissipate a bit. I'd still favour it because I've always said masks on tubes, in shops, vaccine passports to go into nightclubs. I don't think that's going to dramatically change the picture of COVID rates in Britain, but I think the costs are so low we might as well do it. But the government will be able to point to Germany and these countries and say, look, they're having a tough time. And they've introduced those policies that you're talking about. I assume that argument will be made. What's also important to say is that, the reason case rates in the UK are high but so steady is because it does seem like those high case rates has given us some natural immunity that could help us over winter, especially among young people. Obviously, there are downsides. It also means we'll have more people with long COVID. Significantly, though, and this is just a win-win, we are doing very well when it comes to our booster rollout. So as you can see from this chart, the UK has administered more than twice the number of boosters as many of our European neighbours. So there have been 20% of the British population have now received a booster, so a third vaccine dose. Aaron, my question for you, is it possible that this winter or by Easter, Britain, doesn't look like such a basket case when it comes to COVID policy? Could we have people arguing that because we didn't try and suppress cases too dramatically in autumn, that means there wasn't the same pressure to have a lockdown in winter as there will be in some European nations?
That was the argument, and also Sweden's doing surprisingly well, which of course is real sucker for the COVID skeptics. They say we should have adopted this all along. There's a balance there. I can see why you'd adopt that approach with people who are otherwise relatively healthy. Like you say, the downside is, of course, long COVID. This is a giant experiment. On balance, I think the UK government's dealt with this pretty well since January this year, I feel. I don't know how you feel, Michael. It felt like Boris Johnson had turned a bit of a corner in terms of strategic communications, in terms of how assured he was. Yeah, January, February, March felt significantly better than last year. Last year, and I mean, it's easy to forget this, May in particular, May to December last year was probably the worst 7 or 8 months we've ever seen in the history of this country, and poor governance and a complete absence of leadership. From top to bottom, test and trace, the kinds of advice being given, the reopening of schools, the closing of schools, go back for one day, the complete absence of an opposition. There was a complete political failure in dealing with the crisis. A lot better this year, and I think that's reflecting the fact that the UK is doing a bit better. It's not world leading. It's not blowing everyone away, but it's a significant shift, and that's why the Tories still and people forget this. The major political issue for the last 12 months has been COVID. People don't keep up with John Lewis wallpaper and even the corruption stuff. That's huge, and it's not going away, and it's a big story, and it's cutting through. But it's background noise, and that's not going to overtake COVID. Maybe it's beginning to overtake COVID, but it's not going to overtake COVID now until 2022. And the Tories on coronavirus this year have been okay, particularly when you look at how dreadfully they dealt with it a year earlier.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much disagreement about this because lots of people look at the schools and say we let so many kids get COVID-19 when we could have vaccinated them earlier. I think we should have vaccinated them in the summer. But I mean, to be honest, as we always said on this show, when it came to Freedom Day, when it came to opening nightclubs, etc., there were always two reasonable arguments. One, which is to say, let's get a bit of immunity over the summer so that we don't have this huge surge in winter. I mean, it's still incredibly early. It could be the case that cases, if cases do fall in Austria, it'll be because they had a lockdown. So I'm pretty glad we're not in a situation where we have to have a 3-week lockdown. So, I suppose we can appreciate some of the things we have. Obviously, the people in the best situation now are Portugal, where 98.5% of people have been vaccinated. And that was without mandatory vaccination. So we need to work out what their secret was. I need to read more about you. I assume you don't know either, do you? Aaron, do you know how they've managed to do that?
It is a small population. It's 10 million people. So easier to administer than a country. I mean, that's the thing with the US. I feel like people are saying, oh, Israel did it so quickly. The US did it. Of course, Donald Trump's an idiot, etc. But Israel, tiny geographically, small population, the logistical difficulties for a country like the US or China are infinitely harder than for a small European country.
And more variability within the, in terms of the politics of each area. A Schmolbean with £2 says, in Blighty, we remember Wakefield and get our jabs. So I'm assuming that's Andrew Wakefield. He was the scientist who published a pretty dodgy paper about MMR jabs causing autism. I think it turned out he had some conflicts of interest and the whole thing collapsed. All I do know is that the fears were completely unfounded, but it took our vaccination program back by decades. And yeah, it does seem like maybe we have learned from that. Vaccine skepticism incredibly marginal in this country. Let's go to our next story. Before we do that, though, I always do this. Let's go to our but first. If you are already a donor to Novara Media, thank you so much. You make all of this possible. If not, please do consider going to novaramedia.com/support and donating the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. It's what makes all of this possible. We appreciate it so much. Next story. On Novara Media, we often show you clips that have gone viral because a politician says something outrageous or something particularly stupid. Today, however, we have a clip that's gone viral just because it reminded people of a politician's mere existence. This is Tory backbencher Michael Fabricant speaking to GB News.
I don't think there's anything wrong in having a second job, providing it is a second job and not the main job, because you must be, first and foremost, a member of Parliament. But, having said that, I think if you've merely got a second job because you're a member of Parliament, so you've gone to a wealthy company and said, look, I can advise you how to get legislation through, I can advise you what the government's up to, I can even get you meetings with senior ministers. That is wrong. However, when Keir Starmer, and there was nothing wrong with this in my view, when Keir Starmer became an MP, he was able to do it because he carried on doing legal work. That was the second job, but not related to his being well, he wasn't at that stage, not related to his being an MP.
So that was fair dues, you think?
I think it's fair dues. If you've got skills, you're a doctor, a nurse, or some other thing which is not connected with Parliament, and you want to keep your hand in, not just for the money, but to know what the latest thoughts are in that area, I think it actually gives a benefit, providing that, as I say, you don't spend so much time on it.
That was Michael Fabricant making a fairly ordinary point about MPs and second jobs. Nothing at all remarkable there. But the clip still has over 1 million views. Why could that be? Let's look at a sample of the best commentary. One Twitter user said, "You can't slap hair on your head like this and expect people to focus on what you have to say." I also like this meme, which was going around. "Alexa, what happens if you microwave Boris Johnson?" And this was perhaps my favourite one. "This feels like one of those psychological experiments where you're supposed to focus on people passing a ball while a gorilla is twerking in the middle of the circle. What is that on his head?" Aaron, we tend to avoid, mocking people for their appearances on this show. I think it is legitimate in this case because he has chosen that barnet. Right, that hair doesn't come naturally to him. He could have got a different wig, or if it's not a wig, he could have got a different hair transplant. He's definitely chosen that look, and so it is ripe for a little bit of mockery.
Well, what if it's real, Michael?
Well, we do actually have some details about this. Well, he said,
know. "Oh, we do. Okay.
Let's go to the details about it. Let's go straight to it. So Michael Fabricant's locks have attracted attention, and in 2019. An MP, Hugh Merriman, was caught on camera discussing Fabricant's hair. This is in Parliament. If you look behind Michael Fabricant, you can see the person making the comments that became controversial.
Will my right honourable friend welcome the new Birmingham Airport Master Plan, which addresses its growth in services for businessmen on holiday.
So that was the MP saying it's a wig. Michael Fabricant has said it's not a wig, or he hasn't confirmed it's a wig, but he says, I quote, "There is some, but only some enhancement of his follicular area." So yeah, implants or a wig. Looks like a wig to me, not implants.
If it makes him happy, if it gives him more confidence in life, good luck to him. Not everybody is like Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. Not everybody looks good with a skin, or indeed Michael Walker. Not everybody looks good with little hair. I mean, you look great with little hair. Maybe Michael Fabricant doesn't have your natural confidence.
Maybe his skull's not an amazing shape. Whatever he was thinking with his hair, this is one of those moments where a ridiculous politician comes to our attention, someone who we can't believe has power in this country. That was Michael Fabricant this week. And this is a good opportunity to go to some examples of the things he's said and done, other than, however he's organised his hair. A few examples. In 2014, following a debate between Yasmin Alabai-Brown and Rod Liddle, Fabricant tweeted the following: "I could never appear on a discussion programme with Yasmin Alabai. I would either end up with a brain hemorrhage or by punching her in the throat." When Trump visited the UK, he tweeted a photoshopped picture of London's Muslim mayor, Sadiq Khan, having sex with a pig. And there was a protest about Israel bombing Gaza. He called the people protesting primitives. So you can see here, these primitives are trying to bring to London what they do in the Middle East. All of these tweets have since been deleted, and apologies given of various levels of sincerity. Aaron, how do people like this maintain such prominence in British public life. What's going on here? I'm just a bit, I'm at a loss as to why this guy is one of the most powerful people in Britain, one of the 650 people who get to make our laws.
Yeah, he's not an advert for democracy, is he? I mean, another one, was it Sir Geoffrey Cox? This guy was like a meme during 2019, 2020. I think last month he made £54,000 for it. Not 50 thought, £54,000 on top of his parliamentary work last month. So this idea that, he's just doing a bit on the side, he's just a doctor or a lawyer, £54,000 in 1 month. You're looking at more than £500,000 in a calendar year for that kind of work. I don't know, is that gross or net? Who knows? Is he even paying tax in the UK? I mean, I'm not going to impute anything. I have no idea. The figure that we saw in the press was £54,000 for 1 month's work. So, it's a question I ask myself again and again with parliamentarians, Michael. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier about, first past the post in our electoral system. In first past the post, which has some advantages, I don't like it, you do see the primary political quality and characteristic which is rewarded being loyalty. And politics is essentially a game of snakes and ladders. And it's about being able to navigate a party political organization. It's like being Frank in House of Cards. That's less an issue in systems with proportional representation, the internal chicanery and politicking within the Conservative or the Labour Party. And that's how people like Michael Fabricant are parliamentarians. That's not to say if you have proportional representation, they don't exist, because with PR, you get closed list systems. You might have a leader doing the exact same thing. But of course, then they look kind of stupid because they say, why have you put this person in? They're terrible at their job. Whereas when you've got this amorphous blob like the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, you have these sort of talentless people, and they can be in these seats 20, 30, 40 years. And Michael Chope in Christchurch, another one, a Conservative MP. And people just think, how the hell has that guy been there so long? I mean, what has he done? Apart from sort of rock up on GB News, say some stuff, look a bit, interesting, a bit unique. I mean, fine, it's eye-catching. It's a bit of, internet banter. Probably shouldn't be a parliamentarian. Probably shouldn't be one of the 650 people running this country. Making laws, determining what taxes we pay, how much, what gets built, dealing with the housing crisis, climate change, etc. Maybe we should have higher expectations than pointing at them and saying, what a character.
Is this a new theory of electoral systems that under PR, people have better hair?
That's a really good question, Michael. I think we get more serious, but I do think we get more serious politicians under PR. I think you get more ideological extremism. Look, I'm an ideological extremist. I'm on the radical left. I like to think of myself as objective as well. But I know people that disagree with me might not think I'm objective. That's their decision. Fine, whatever. You get more ideological kind of polarization, but I do think you get more sensible people in government, people who aren't, chaos merchants like Michael Fabricant.
Let's go straight on to our next story. We're going to do this one fairly quickly. Andrew Marr has announced he is leaving the BBC after working for the corporation for 21 years. Announcing the decision, he tweeted, "Personal announcement. After 21 years, I have decided to move on from the BBC. I leave behind many happy memories and wonderful colleagues. But from the new year, I am moving to Global to write and present political and cultural shows and to write for newspapers." Global is the media organisation which includes, I think, Capital, but definitely LBC and Classic FM, which are apparently the two stations he will be working for. He goes on to say, "I think British politics and public life are going to go through an even more turbulent decade. And as I've said, I am keen to get my own voice back." So he's tired of being at the BBC where he cannot say what he thinks because he has to be impartial. He's going to LBC and Classic FM to have some opinions. And finally, he says, "I have been doing the Andrew Marr show every Sunday morning for 16 years now, and that is probably more than enough time for anybody." We spoke about Andrew Marr's future career on a recent show because he appeared in, I think it was a Guardian article where they were saying that they were holding Andrew Marr on until the Queen died because he had a big role in lots of the coverage concerning her death. So when it comes to conspiracies that she's already gone or that she's about to go very soon, you could say Andrew Marr leaving in the new year could fit into that. It might also just be that the guy's bored of working at the BBC. Aaron, big story. Will this affect the BBC's political coverage in any meaningful sense?
Well, look, how's it going to affect Michael Walker? You are his number one critic. You're the person who watches the Marr show every Sunday and go, who is this guy? He's not done an interesting, penetrating political interview for about a decade. It's worrying. So I'm concerned for you, Michael. Who are you going to pick at now at the BBC? Now that Raccoonsburg's going, go on.
I'm sure whoever they replace him with will there'll be a lot of problems. But Andrew Marr is especially, I have to say, he doesn't seem like, he's not the most dislikable guy in TV, but he has not been very well briefed for quite a while now when he interviews politicians. He's the least scary interviewer you could possibly face.
I think he's terrible. And I don't like really many BBC journalists. I think you look at something like Lewis Goodall, who's 20, 30 years younger than him. I don't know the exact numbers. He's so much more on top of things, so much more dynamic, so much more energy. The point of duffers like Andrew Marr is they don't really say very much. Great interview with Noam Chomsky years ago, and he says to Chomsky, "Why do you think I self-censor? I don't self-censor, and nobody tells me what to say." And Chomsky says, "Well, if you asked the wrong questions, you wouldn't be here working for the BBC interviewing me." And that's a perfect explanation as to why Andrew Marr has his job. In 2014, he's a novelist, by the way. Talk about second jobs, despite us paying for him to be a journalist at the BBC. He's a novelist. He wrote a novel, political novel. Has anybody read it? No idea. I've never really seen it in a bookshop. But it was launched at number 10 Downing Street. And you think, hold on, you're meant to be holding these people accountable. You're meant to be scrutinizing their work as a journalist in your day job, which we all pay for. And you're so chummy with them. They're doing you a favor that you can launch your little book, which nobody's going to read at number 10 in an evening soiree. Is that really how it's meant to work? Really? How can you be trusted to be holding them to account when you're calling in favors from them? They should be scared of you. So that's what I think about Andrew Marr's kind of genre of political journalism. It's condensed in that little anecdote, that little vignette, Michael, of him launching his 2014 novel, which nobody's ever read, in number 10 Downing Street.
Yeah, I didn't know he had a novel, which I suppose proves your point, really. But yeah, as you say, I think that's a very interesting fact that he launched it at number 10. That sums up quite a lot about British political journalism. Let's go to our final story. British cricket is in crisis. That's after a disgraceful ruling by Yorkshire County Cricket Club that racial epithets were just banter, and the powerful testimony of Azim Rafiq, who has been speaking publicly about the racism he was subjected to at the club. This was Rafiq giving evidence earlier in the week to the Culture, Media and Sport Committee.
I started to see for what it was, felt isolated, humiliated at times, constant use of the word packy. And this happened in front of teammates, it happened in front of coaching staff. We were on a bus trip in London to Surrey game, and we went past a couple of men with beard, and it was like, "Oh, is that your dad?" If we go past a corner shop, "Oh, does your uncle own this?" I mean, to make one thing very clear, packy is not banter. Racism is not banter. End of 2017, we had a really difficult pregnancy. And through that time, the treatment that I received from some of the club officials were inhuman. They weren't really bothered about the fact that I was at training one day and I get a phone call to say there's no heartbeat. Sorry. At the time when I left, I had, I think, 4 or 5 months left on my contract. I was encouraged to sign a confidentiality form and take a sum of money, which I refused, which at that time would have been a lot of money for me. I knew my wife was struggling. I knew I was struggling. There was no way mentally I could have even considered putting myself through this trauma. I actually left the country. I went to Pakistan. I never wanted to come back. I know that the pain that I went through for them few months, no one can ever put me through that pain again.
That harrowing testimony from Rafiq has sparked a wider conversation about racism in cricket, but also about racism in Britain more generally. And some of that commentary, some of those interventions, both in the mainstream media and in Parliament, have been pretty thoughtful. I think it has sparked a useful and productive conversation in many ways. Other interventions have been less so. This was a question put to the Question Time panel this week. So the panel were asked, with the revelations from cricket's Azeem Rafiq and footballers still taking the knee, what does this say about racism in present-day Britain? Reasonable question. The question wasn't the example of useless commentary. This is the example of useless commentary. It's how Canadian philosopher Jordan Peterson answered the question.
Things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own account. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
he was
containers of undifferentiated content.
He was repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's had people contact him. If it walks like a duck, Jordan, talks like a duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem. The concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
How could you go on a national TV show without having done any research whatsoever into the story? It's like, we have to be very specific here. We have to be very particular. Who called who, what, when? Well, as Stella Creasy said, we know precisely who was called what and by who. So it was Rafiq. He was called many racial epithets by other members of his team over a long period of time. When Jordan Peterson says, institutional racism, that would be too abstract. Well, an investigation into those incidents by the cricket club found that using these racial epithets was just banter and actually blamed Azeem Rafiq for taking it too seriously. So there is clearly institutional racism going on at that club. There have also been complaints about the fact that the National Cricket Board was not, intervening proactively enough into the case, which has led to, I think, a very persuasive charge of institutional racism there. And then one thing that has been very, very present in all of these sort of descriptions of what happened at that cricket club is that people accepted racism as if it were normal. Now, that sounds quite structural to me. That's not just about individuals. That's about how all of these individuals were socialized into the same society, which accepts racism. Aaron, we've talked about Jordan Peterson before on the show, but I thought that was especially, it was just dumb, wasn't it? You're saying everyone else is guilty of low resolution thinking, which is the kind of thinking that means that you might have to read before you speak.
Yeah, I've got two words for Jordan Peterson, Michael, if he's watching, which is eat carbohydrates. Stop this whole meat diet. Stop this whole meat diet and salt, because you've got the low resolution thinking. You could see he was thinking really slowly and he's really tired. Jordan, have a bowl of pasta, have a sandwich, have some rice, have some roast potatoes, freshen things up. Because of course he's on this crazy diet of meat, salt and water. I think it probably isn't helping with his cognitive performance. What was interesting, of course, Michael, is he said, institutional racism doesn't mean anything. If you actually wind that clip back, he says that racism is a global issue. So he contradicts himself quite immediately. And I think he's kind of dining out, Michael, on his reputation. He had one stellar interview with Kathy Newman on Channel 4, where he was like an alt-right version of Bradley Cooper on Limitless, the film. He was just like, Neo in the Matrix. Boom, 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 boom. It's like it's not the same guy, which why, I return to my initial point, which is maybe try eating some carbohydrates. It's probably been several years. It's probably affecting your sleep. It is a whole macronutrient. There's 3: fats, proteins, carbohydrates. You can't eliminate it forever, Jordan. Please do yourself a favor. And until you do, I don't think you should come back on British television, because you make no sense. You make zero sense. Very embarrassing, not just for him, Michael, but also for his publisher. Because he did look like an intellectual charlatan there. Really. What the hell is he doing on television? You see people on Twitter going, who is this Canadian guy? He's making no sense. It was quite funny. A year ago, 2 years ago, 2 years ago, he was this enormous Anglosphere intellectual heavyweight. And it does feel that, how he's talking and so on, it's a different guy. So, eat a sandwich. Let's see how it goes.
Eat some carbs. I want to show one tweet that I think also, because in that case, it seems sort of like, he was put on the spot. He just hadn't done the preparation before the show. Also, obviously, an incredibly obnoxious person. He tweeted something earlier in the week, which, obviously he wasn't put on the spot there, which I think just shows how both shallow and reactionary his philosophy is. So he tweets, "There is simply no such thing as social justice. Whatever those who rely on this cliched phrase are aiming at has nothing whatsoever to do with justice. Justice is mated out at the level of the suffering individual." But who is it mated out by? It doesn't make any sense. What about unjust laws? How does that fit into that framework? What about an unjust distribution of resources? How would you possibly describe that without mentioning society or the state or the economy? It's sort of bad undergrad tweeting, isn't it? And this is a guy who sees himself as an intellectual titan.
Yeah, well, that was his shtick, Michael, and that's very sellable, right? You don't need to care about minorities. You don't need to challenge the political economic status quo. Tidy your room. Tidy your room. And then, of course, there's the images of Jordan Peterson's house looking like a shit show. So, yeah, the right has had some really impressive, especially the English-speaking right over the last 100, 150 years, has had some really impressive right-wing intellectuals and novelists, right? Evelyn Waugh, P.G. Wodehouse, you go back to the 19th century, you've got European figures, you've got Wagner, you've got Nietzsche, smart people. And it says something about conservatism as a political tradition, as an intellectual tradition, that this guy is the flame holder for it, because he hasn't really got that much to say. He's got some identikit arguments on freedom of speech, and that's kind of about it. He's not that intellectually curious. He seems quite limited in his range of interests. He is where he is, Michael, because frankly, there is always going to be a massive audience to tell arseholes that it's okay to be an arsehole and to get a publishing deal off the back of it. There's always going to be an audience for that. Is he adding value as a conservative intellectual? I don't think so. I do like to read these books and sort of engage with what these people are saying and thinking. And I listened to, what was this book called? The 12 Laws of, I don't know, Michael. You tell me. You read this stuff.
12 Rules for Life is the book. We did our first Tisky Sour was on 12 Rules for Life years ago.
No, there you go. We've come a long way, Michael. Thank Christ. I glanced over the text, but I listened to it as an audio book. It's terrible, and also it's really long. It's like 500 pages. Read Dostoevsky. If you're going to invest that much in a book, Christ, it's not like it's 150 pages. Then I get it. Disposable trash ideology. This is actually an investment of your time, and he's not really saying very much. We don't need to go into Jordan Peterson. I think one of the reasons why he was so big as well, Michael, is because people are looking for answers. In a way, that's a really positive thing. People are looking for big ideas. I just think he has particularly bad, big ideas.
Let's go through a bunch of comments. Jovian R with a fiver. I always felt Jordan Peterson operates at the level of Ayn Rand at best. I have to admit, I've never read Ayn Rand. Henry VIII, fake with a fiver, says he looked the thesaurus and his brain hit shuffle. Very good. Leona tweeted on the hashtag Tisky Sour that when we talked about Fabricant being a microwaved Boris Johnson, her Alexa went off. Oh, because the meme was, Alexa, what does it look like if you microwave Boris Johnson? Apologies for that. Hugh Morgan with 32 New Zealand dollars. Thank you so much. It's my 32nd birthday, and what would make it really special is warm birthday wishes from National Treasure Michael Walker. Happy birthday, Hugh Morgan. I hope you have a wonderful day. Great age. I'm also 32. Aaron, he says, your Twitter feed is like an open university course. Thanks.
That's good. I have to tell myself to sort of tweet less about how big an arsehole Keir Starmer is, because, you know, it can become an obsession, especially when he makes such an effort to go out every day and do stupid things. But yeah, I mean, look, I've written a book about a post-capitalist economy. I've got another book coming out, but that is very reassuring. I do hope it's informative. That's what it's all about.
Saul with a fiver says, forget Marr, great win by Indian farmers today. Yeah, a historic victory, maybe something Novara could cover in the future. I think that's a great idea. When those protests were first sort of, coming to the fore, we did do some shows on that. Oh, forget Marr, sorry, not Marr. When those protests were first coming to the fore, we did do a couple of shows on those. You can search those in our back catalogue. But now that the farmers have won, which is a completely phenomenal result, we perhaps will revisit that. Joshua Youngerman with a fiver. Rittenhouse found not guilty on all charges. Infuriated but not surprised. The system is working exactly the way it was designed to in America. I'm pretty sure we'll come back to that story next week. And PTAH with a fiver says, would be nice if you could do something about children in need and asking people to give to charity who themselves may need the help. Interesting tweet. So it's children in need tonight. They're asking people to donate. I assume that super chat is suggesting that because there's so much poverty in the country, maybe the people who they are requesting for those donations are themselves in poverty. And Victoria tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, Aaron on top form tonight. Thanks for the laughs. Aaron, thank you for the laughs. Thank you for your interventions, as always. It's been a pleasure being joined by you tonight.
You're always a pleasure to be with, Michael. You know, the master of ceremony when it comes to current affairs and Novara media. It's always a gift to watch you in action.
A safe pair of hands is how I like to think about it. We'll be back on Monday at 7 p.m. For now, you've been watching Tisky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.